The ammonia smell of industrial cleaner clung to my hands as I pushed the supply cart down the dim hallway of Westbrook Elementary, my third hour into a shift that wouldn't end until midnight when I'd rush across town to stock shelves at the 24-hour grocery. The school felt different after dark, shadows stretching long and hungry across the polished floors I'd just mopped, and I was thinking about the past due notice on my electric bill when I heard it. A muffled sob coming from the supply closet near the science lab. My heart seized because children weren't supposed to be here this late, and I moved quickly, quietly, years of staying invisible making my steps silent. I opened the door to find him wedged between shelving units, a small boy, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair and enormous terrified eyes, tears cutting tracks down his flushed cheeks. He flinched when he saw me, pressing harder against the wall like he wanted to disappear into it. "It's okay," I whispered, crouching down to make myself smaller, less threatening. "I'm Eleanor. I work here. Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but his whole body trembled. And before I could coax more from him, I heard them. Male voices, older, rough with the particular cruelty of teenagers who'd learned violence young. They were searching, calling out taunts that made my blood ice. "Little rich boy. Where you hiding? Just want to talk. Should have minded your business." The boy's eyes went huge, pleading silently. An instinct overrode every self-preservation reflex I possessed. I pulled my cart into the closet, positioned myself in front of him, and put my finger to my lips. His small hand clutched the fabric of my uniform shirt, and I could feel his heart hammering against my spine when the footsteps stopped outside our door. The door slammed open, and 3 teenagers filled the frame, wearing red bandanas and carrying themselves with that dangerous swagger I recognized from my father's world, the world that had swallowed him and left me drowning in his debts. They looked at me with flat predator eyes, taking in my janitor uniform, my exhaustion, calculating my worth. "You seen a kid?" the tallest one demanded, stepping close enough that I smelled cigarettes and something sharper. "Rich little snitch ran this way." I forced my expression into confused concern, my voice steady despite the terror singing through my veins. "Been cleaning the East Wing all night. Haven't seen any students. You sure you should be here?" "School's closed." The leader's eyes narrowed and he moved closer, invading my space deliberately, testing. "You lying to me?" Behind me, the boy had gone perfectly still, barely breathing. I held the teenager's stare, channeling every ounce of exhausted indifference I could muster. "Just trying to finish my shift and get home. Check the other halls if you want." He studied me long enough that sweat gathered between my shoulder blades, then jerked his chin toward the others. "Come on. Not here." They retreated, but their voices echoed threats as they moved away, promises of what they'd do when they found him, and I stayed frozen until silence returned. The boy released my shirt and crumpled, sobbing harder now, all the fear releasing at once. I turned and gathered him close without thinking. This small stranger with his expensive watch glinting in the dim light and initials embroidered on his uniform, TH in elegant script that spoke of wealth and privilege I'd never known. "Shh, you're safe now," I murmured against his hair, feeling his arms lock around my waist with desperate strength. "I've got you. You're safe." Alexander Harcourt sat behind the mahogany desk in his office, the city sprawling below his penthouse windows like a kingdom he ruled from the shadows, and he was reviewing security reports when James Whitmore entered without knocking, which meant urgency, which meant threat. "Thomas," James said, and Alexander's blood turned to ice because that single word contained every vulnerability he possessed in this world. "The school," James continued, placing a tablet on the desk. "Tonight." Alexander's fingers moved across the screen, pulling up footage his people had acquired from Westbrook Elementary's security system, cameras the school didn't even know had been compromised months ago when he'd enrolled Thomas there under layers of false documentation. The timestamp read 2 hours ago. He watched his son, his Thomas, hiding in a supply closet, terror written across features so achingly similar to Catherine's that Alexander's chest constricted. Then the woman appeared, this janitor in a stained uniform, and she positioned herself between his son and danger without hesitation. The Redmond crew, James confirmed quietly. 3 of their junior members. Thomas witnessed a handoff near the science wing. Alexander watched the confrontation, seeing how the woman lied with remarkable calm, how she held his son after they left. And something shifted in his chest, tightening and expanding simultaneously. "Where is Thomas now?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "Home with Mrs. Peterson," James answered. "He hasn't spoken since she picked him up. Won't say what happened. The nanny doesn't know." Alexander's jaw clenched because his son had learned silence from trauma, had learned to bury fear because speaking it made things real. "The woman," he said. James slid a folder across the desk. "Eleanor Thornhill, 28, single, working 3 jobs including the janitorial position at Westbrook. Her father was Michael Thornhill, low-level enforcer for the Costello family until gambling debts got him killed 18 months ago. She inherited approximately $47,000 in outstanding debt to various creditors. Clean record herself, no criminal associations we can find." Alexander studied her photograph. This ordinary woman with exhausted eyes who'd been brave enough to shield a stranger's child. "Buy the debts," he instructed. "All of them. Tonight." James nodded, unsurprised, already moving. "And the Redmond crew," Alexander continued, his voice dropping to that register his people knew meant death. "The 3 who touched my son, handle it, permanently, make sure their bodies send the right message." "It will be done," James confirmed and left, leaving Alexander alone with the footage. He replayed it 4 times, watching Eleanor Thornhill's hands steady on his son's shoulders, watching how Thomas clung to her like she was salvation, and Alexander made his decision with the cold calculation that had built his empire, but also with something softer, something grateful and desperate, that he barely recognized anymore. Across the city in her cramped apartment, with its persistent mold smell and temperamental heating, Eleanor lay awake in the dark, unable to stop seeing the boy's terrified face, wondering if he was safe now, if those monsters had found him later, and she stared at water stains on her ceiling, knowing she'd done the only thing possible, but terrified it hadn't been enough. The summons came at 10 in the morning when I was scrubbing graffiti off bathroom stalls, my supervisor's nervous voice telling me Principal Davies needed to see me immediately, and my stomach dropped because immediate summons in my world meant trouble, meant someone had complained, or I was being let go, another income stream evaporating like water in desert heat. I pulled off my rubber gloves, checked my reflection in the streaked mirror, seeing exhaustion and anxiety in a face that used to be prettier before years of survival etched themselves into my features, and I walked toward the administrative offices with dread coiling through my intestines. The principal's door was open, and I saw him first. This man who made the air itself seem to bend around him, tall and broad-shouldered in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, dark hair styled with casual precision, and a face that would be devastating if it weren't so carefully controlled. All sharp angles and full lips, set in an expression of polite neutrality that somehow felt more dangerous than any scowl. Principal Davies stood beside his desk, practically vibrating with nervous energy, hands clasped and unclasped repeatedly, and then I saw Thomas, the boy from last night, standing close to the man in the expensive suit, and relief flooded through me so intensely, my knees weakened because he was safe. He was alive. Those monsters hadn't found him. Thomas saw me at the same moment, and his whole face transformed. Fear replaced by joy so pure it hurt to witness, and he ran across the room and wrapped his arms around my legs with that same desperate trust from the supply closet. And I couldn't help myself. I crouched down and hugged him back, checking him over with my eyes and hands, making sure he was truly unharmed. "Miss Thornhill," the principal said with strained formality, "this is Mr. Harcourt, Thomas's father." The man moved closer, and I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, dark eyes that assessed me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, seeing too much, calculating things I couldn't begin to guess, and when he extended his hand, I took it, his grip warm and controlled, and somehow possessive. "Thank you," he said, his voice deep and smooth like expensive whiskey, "for protecting my son last night. Thomas told me what you did." I noticed Thomas still pressed against my side and realized the boy must have finally spoken about the incident, must have trusted his father enough to reveal what happened, and I felt absurdly proud of this child I barely knew. "I just did what anyone would do," I managed, hyper aware of how cheap my uniform looked next to his tailored perfection, how my hands were rough and reddened from chemicals, while his were manicured and bore a watch that glinted platinum. "Not anyone," Alexander Harcourt corrected, and something in his tone made the principal shift uncomfortably. Made me suddenly aware that this man was someone important, someone dangerous, someone whose name meant things I should probably recognize. Most people would have looked away, protected themselves, avoided trouble. You put yourself between threat and my son without hesitation. That deserves more than simple thanks. He glanced at Principal Davies, who immediately stammered that he'd give us privacy, practically fleeing his own office, and I understood with creeping certainty that Alexander Harcourt was not just wealthy, but powerful in ways that made school administrators terrified, in ways that may be connected to the world my father had died owing money to. "Mr. Harcourt," I started, but he held up one hand. "Alexander, please. Miss Thornhill, I have a proposition for you. Thomas needs a nanny, someone he trusts. Someone who has already proven they will protect him. I am offering you a position in my household, live-in, caring for my son, at a salary of $15,000 monthly." The number hit me like physical impact because that was triple what I made working myself to exhaustion across 3 jobs. That was freedom from drowning. That was breathing room I hadn't experienced since my father's debts became mine. But suspicion rose immediately because men like this didn't offer salvation without strings. "I can't," I said reflexively, even as my heart screamed at me to accept, to grab this lifeline with both hands. "I have obligations, commitments." "Your father's debts," Alexander said quietly, and ice flooded my veins, because how did he know? How much did he know? What exactly was happening here? "I own them now, Miss Thornhill. All of them. Purchased last night." His expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held something I couldn't read, something that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation. "I am not threatening you," he continued, before I could find words through my shock and rising panic. "I am offering you a clean slate, debt forgiveness in increments as you care for Thomas, and a chance to provide my son with the protection and affection he desperately needs. You have 24 hours to consider." His card appeared in his hand like magic, expensive paper with embossed lettering, a phone number printed in understated font. Thomas hugged me tighter, his small voice muffled against my uniform. "Please stay, Eleanor," he whispered. And Alexander Harcourt's mask cracked just slightly, something raw and vulnerable flashing across his features before control reasserted itself, and I took the card with trembling fingers, trapped between terror and desperate hope, knowing my answer would change everything, but having no idea just how completely my world was about to transform. I lay in my narrow bed in the apartment that smelled like mildew and desperation, staring at the water-stained ceiling while sirens wailed somewhere in the distance, and my mind churned through impossible calculations, turning Alexander Harcourt's offer over and over like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together in any configuration that made sense. 15,000 monthly was freedom, was breathing room, was the ability to sleep without nightmares about collectors and threats, and the weight of my father's mistakes crushing me into nothing. But it also meant entering a world I'd spent my entire adult life trying to avoid. the world that had devoured my father and spit out his corpse as a warning to others about debts and loyalty and the price of weakness. Alexander Harcourt was dangerous. That much had been written in every line of his controlled posture, in the way Principal Davies had practically trembled in his presence, in the careful neutrality of his expression that somehow felt more threatening than any scowl, and I knew enough from my father's involvement with the Costello family to recognize power when it stood before me in expensive tailoring and spoke in smooth, civilized tones about propositions and opportunities. But Thomas, God, Thomas with his tear-stained face and his desperate arms around my legs, this child who'd already lost his mother and clearly lived with fear as a constant companion, he'd looked at me like I was safety incarnate, like I was something worth clinging to, and my chest ached remembering how he'd whispered, "Please stay," with such naked hope in his small voice. I turned onto my side, pulling my threadbare blanket higher against the cold that seeped through my apartment's inadequate heating, and I tried to imagine what accepting would mean. Tried to picture myself in that man's home caring for his traumatized son. And the image that formed was equal parts terrifying and seductive because it meant security, but also entanglement, meant protection, but also possession, meant escape from drowning, but potentially into different darker waters. The card sat on my nightstand, cream-colored paper with embossed lettering that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and I reached for it in the darkness, running my thumb over the raised numbers, wondering what would happen if I called, if I said yes, if I let Alexander Harcourt pull me into his orbit with all the gravitational inevitability that implied. Sleep came in fragments, dreams mixing memory and imagination, my father's disappointed face morphing into Thomas's frightened one, debt collectors transforming into men in expensive suits, making offers that sounded like salvation but tasted like chains. And I woke at dawn with my decision already made, had maybe been made the moment Thomas hugged me, the moment I'd seen that this child needed protection, and I was someone who could provide it regardless of the cost to myself. I called the number at 8 in the morning, my hands steady despite my racing heart, and Alexander answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and unsurprised like he'd known exactly when I'd break. And he said simply, "I will send James to collect you at 2. Bring whatever matters to you." And I realized with creeping certainty that my entire life was about to change in ways I couldn't begin to predict, that I was stepping off a cliff and trusting this dangerous stranger to catch me, and the terror of it was matched only by the strange relief flooding my veins, because at least I was choosing something, at least I was moving forward instead of drowning in place. James arrived precisely at 2 in a black car that screamed money and discretion, older than Alexander, but with the same controlled danger radiating from him, and he helped load my 3 boxes of possessions with careful respect that made me feel both protected and patronized. And then we were driving through the city toward the Eastern District, where estates replaced apartments and money insulated people from the struggles that had defined my entire existence, and my stomach twisted with anticipation and dread as we passed through gates that closed behind us with the finality of doors locking. And I saw it, the Harcourt estate, this mansion disguised as a home, but clearly a fortress with its subtle security measures and carefully maintained grounds, and Alexander was waiting at the entrance, still devastating in tailored perfection, and he greeted me with formal courtesy that somehow felt intimate, leading me to his study, where he laid out the terms of my new life with businesslike precision that couldn't quite hide the intensity in his dark eyes when he mentioned Thomas's well-being and the incremental debt forgiveness tied to my care. And I listened to him explain about nightmares and trauma and his son's desperate need for stability, and I watched his jaw tighten when he mentioned Catherine's death, saw grief buried beneath layers of control, and I understood that this man loved his son with a ferocity that transcended his dangerous reputation, and somehow that made accepting this arrangement feel less like surrender and more like purpose. The first week passed in a blur of sensory overload and constant adjustment, every moment reminding me I'd stepped into a world that operated by rules I didn't understand, where staff members whose salaries probably exceeded my former annual income moved through marble hallways with practiced efficiency, treating me with cautious respect that felt uncomfortably close to deference, their eyes curious and assessing as they tried to determine exactly what I was in the household hierarchy, not quite staff, but certainly not family, existing in some undefined space that made everyone uncertain how to interact with me. Thomas became my anchor in the strangeness, this small boy who followed me everywhere with desperate attachment, sitting beside me during meals and holding my hand when we walked through the sprawling gardens and talking in his quiet voice about things that broke my heart. His loneliness in this beautiful prison, his nightmares about the car accident that took his mother, his fear that everyone he loved would disappear without warning, and I learned that Catherine had died 2 years ago in what appeared to be an accident, but Alexander still investigated as potentially targeted, brake lines tampered with, and the grief in Thomas's eyes when he mentioned her made me want to gather him close and promise impossible things about safety and permanence. The estate itself was overwhelming in its controlled perfection, every detail precise and intentional, the household running with military precision that spoke of Alexander's need for order and control, groundskeepers who moved like soldiers and probably were, cameras hidden in decorative fixtures, security measures disguised as landscaping and architecture, and I understood I was living in a fortress that happened to have bedrooms and a kitchen, a place designed to withstand siege and protect what mattered most to its master. Alexander himself appeared unpredictably, materializing in doorways when I was helping Thomas with homework or reading him stories, watching us with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness, made me hyper-conscious of every movement and word, and I learned to feel his presence before seeing him, some instinct attuned to the dangerous energy he carried like a second skin, and sometimes I'd look up to find him gone, a ghost who observed and vanished, leaving only the sensation of being seen too clearly, understood too well. The fourth night I coaxed Thomas into eating more than 3 bites at dinner by telling him a ridiculous story about a dragon who is afraid of butterflies, making the tale progressively more absurd until the boy was giggling helplessly, his laughter bright and pure and unexpected. And I glanced toward the dining room entrance to find Alexander standing there frozen, his controlled mask cracked open, raw emotion flickering across his devastating features, hope and pain and something desperate mixing together before control reasserted itself, and he turned away. But not before I saw his hands trembling slightly. Not before I understood that hearing his son laugh was something precious and rare, a sound Alexander had perhaps thought lost forever. That night I woke to sounds from Thomas's room, crying that pulled me from sleep instantly, and I rushed down the hallway expecting to find the boy alone and terrified, but Alexander was already there, sitting on the small bed with Thomas in his arms, rocking him gently while the child sobbed about monsters and crashes and people leaving, and Alexander looked devastatingly lost. This powerful, dangerous man completely undone by his inability to fix his son's pain, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. And when our gazes met over Thomas's dark head, something passed between us, some wordless understanding about love and helplessness, and the desperate need to protect what we couldn't always save. And I moved forward without thinking, sitting beside them and adding my arms to the embrace, helping hold this broken child together while his father's control shattered in the darkness. And none of us spoke, but everything changed in that moment. Some boundary crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, some recognition that we were all 3 lost in different ways, and maybe together could find something resembling safety. The boundaries I'd carefully maintained between professional duty and personal involvement began eroding like sand against relentless tide, subtle at first, and then suddenly obvious to everyone including myself, starting when Alexander appeared at breakfast on the 9th morning, drawn by Thomas's newfound happiness, like a man who'd forgotten what joy sounded like and couldn't resist moving closer to its source. And he sat at the head of the long table watching his son chatter excitedly about plans for the day, something shifting in his carefully controlled expression, softening in increments so small I might have imagined them. Except I was learning to read the minute tells of emotion beneath his mask. The way his jaw relaxed fractionally when Thomas giggled, the warmth entering his dark eyes when the boy reached unconsciously for my hand while talking. I began noticing details about Alexander I hadn't let myself see before, how his hands were elegant and careful when he helped Thomas with difficult tasks, fingers that I knew were capable of violence moving with infinite gentleness to tie shoelaces or fix shirt collars, and how he struggled to express love through anything but material provision and physical protection, buying expensive gifts that Thomas accepted with polite gratitude but less enthusiasm than he showed for my silly stories. And I watched this powerful, dangerous man fumble with the simple intimacy his son craved, watched frustration tighten his features when he couldn't find words to comfort, couldn't bridge the emotional distance his own upbringing had taught him to maintain. He caught me watching sometimes, his gaze locking with mine across rooms with an intensity that made breathing difficult, made my skin flush and my heart race with something that definitely wasn't professional respect. And I'd force myself to look away first, to remember my position here. But the awareness between us grew heavier with each passing day, each shared moment over Thomas's head. Each time our hands accidentally brushed when we both reached to steady the boy or guide him through some task. The afternoon everything changed. Thomas begged us both to play with him in the garden, his small face so hopeful and excited that neither of us could refuse despite the careful distance we'd been maintaining. And suddenly, we were on our knees in grass building elaborate block towers while Thomas directed us like a tiny general, laughing when Alexander's architectural skills proved embarrassingly inadequate and my towers kept toppling over. And then we were chasing butterflies through flower beds. Alexander's jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up, and his rare, genuine smile transforming his face into something almost boyish. The feared crime boss disappearing beneath the father who'd forgotten how to play until this moment, and I felt my chest tighten watching him sweep Thomas up in his arms and spin him in circles while the boy shrieked with delight, felt something dangerous and irrevocable shifting in my heart. Later, while putting Thomas to bed, the boy asked sleepily if I would stay forever, his voice small and vulnerable in the darkened room. And I promised him tonight, unable to promise more without knowing what Alexander wanted or what I was even allowed to want in this strange situation. And I kissed his forehead and watched him drift to sleep, clutching the stuffed bear I'd bought him with my first paycheck from this impossible job. Downstairs, I found Alexander waiting in the small sitting room off the main hall, 2 glasses of wine already poured, and he gestured for me to sit with formal courtesy that somehow felt intimate, and he thanked me for today, for helping Thomas remember how to be a child. But his voice held something else beneath the gratitude, something raw and uncertain, and then words were spilling out about Catherine, about how their relationship had been strategic rather than passionate, arranged for Thomas's protection when Alexander's enemies were circling and he needed legitimate cover, how he'd cared for her and mourned her death, but she'd never been his great love, never touched the parts of himself he'd locked away long before they met. And the loneliness in his admission made my chest ache, because I understood too well what it meant to perform care while feeling hollow inside, to go through motions of connection without ever really being seen or known by another person. And I sat there holding wine I wasn't drinking while this dangerous, beautiful man revealed vulnerabilities that probably made me a liability he should eliminate, but instead made him devastatingly human. James found me in the library 3 days after the wine-soaked conversation with Alexander's, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant bad news was coming. And he closed the door with deliberate care before informing me that Marcus Pembroke, the rival boss whose territory bordered Alexander's eastern holdings, was making inquiries about the new nanny, asking questions that indicated uncomfortably detailed knowledge about my presence in the household. And my stomach dropped because even I understood what that meant, how I'd become a piece on a chessboard I didn't know I was playing on, leverage against a man whose enemies would use any vulnerability they discovered. Alexander's response was immediate and overwhelming, security tripling overnight, new guards appearing at every entrance and along the estate perimeter, cameras installed in locations I hadn't known existed. And he summoned me to his study that evening with formal courtesy that felt wrong after the intimacy we'd been building, informing me with controlled precision that I was no longer permitted to leave the estate grounds without explicit clearance and armed escort, that my safety had become a priority, requiring certain restrictions for everyone's protection, and the reasonable tone couldn't disguise the command beneath. The assumption that I would simply accept confinement because he'd decided it necessary. The anger that ignited in my chest surprised me with its intensity, weeks of careful deference and measured responses burning away under the realization that despite everything, despite the moments of vulnerability and connection, Alexander still saw me as something to be managed and controlled rather than consulted, and I heard myself asking if I was prisoner or employee, if the locked doors were for my protection or his convenience, and his jaw tightened in that way that meant I'd struck something true and unwelcome. He stood from behind his massive desk, moving around it with predatory grace that should have warned me to back down, but instead made me hold my ground, and he explained with deadly patience that the Redmond crew had Pembroke connections, that the teenagers who'd threatened Thomas had been low-level operatives in a larger organization, that by protecting his son, I'd made myself visible to people who would happily use me to hurt him. And didn't I understand that my safety wasn't negotiable, that he would lock me in a tower if that's what keeping me alive required? And I shot back that I wasn't some delicate possession to be stored safely away, that I'd survived years of debt collectors and threats before ever meeting him, that being protected shouldn't mean being suffocated. We stood too close, anger crackling between us, along with something else, something heated and dangerous, and his voice dropped to barely above whisper when he promised that anyone who tried to harm me would pray for death long before he granted it, that he would burn the entire city to ash before allowing another person under his protection to be hurt because of him. And the declaration should have terrified me, should have reminded me exactly who and what Alexander Harcourt was. But instead, heat flooded through my veins because underneath the threat was raw fear, desperate need to keep safe what he was beginning to care for. And I watched his control fracture in real time, watched his hands clench and unclench at his sides like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for me, watched his dark eyes go molten with emotions he couldn't quite suppress, and the air between us felt charged and impossible. Everything we hadn't said and couldn't say, pressing against the boundaries we'd been so carefully maintaining. And then Thomas's voice called from somewhere down the hall asking if I could read him bedtime stories now. His timing both terrible and perfect. And Alexander stepped back abruptly, his jaw clenched hard enough that muscles jumped beneath skin, his eyes holding mine for one more combustible moment before he turned away. But not before I saw the promise there. The certainty that this conversation was unfinished and the things building between us wouldn't stay contained much longer. Thomas mentioned it casually during breakfast on the 12th day, commenting between bites of toast that Daddy never sleeps well, that sometimes he hears him walking the halls at night, and the boy's worried eyes flicked toward me as if I might have solutions to problems he didn't understand, and I filed the information away while redirecting conversation to safer topics. But afterward, I found myself noticing details I'd been too overwhelmed to register before, the shadows beneath Alexander's eyes that expensive suits and commanding presence couldn't quite disguise, the way his focus would drift mid-conversation as if his thoughts had snagged on something dark and inescapable. The coffee he consumed in quantities that suggested sleep was more enemy than refuge, and once, passing the hall bathroom, I glimpsed prescription bottles in the cabinet before the door swung shut, the orange plastic unmistakable even in that brief flash. I couldn't sleep myself that night, restless with thoughts of the argument earlier, the way Alexander's control had fractured, showing me the depth of feeling he was trying to contain. And near 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely, pulling on a robe and wandering downstairs with some vague intention of warm milk or chamomile tea or any of the useless remedies people recommend for racing minds. But passing the library, I saw light beneath the door, warm and golden against dark hallway. And professional distance suggested I continue to the kitchen and leave Alexander to whatever solitude he'd sought. But something deeper, some recognition of shared wounds and careful loneliness, made me push the door open quietly. He sat in the leather chair facing the cold fireplace, still fully dressed despite the hour, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand, and the bottle on the side table suggesting it wasn't his first pour. And he looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across features that seemed younger and more vulnerable in the low lamplight. The careful mask he maintained slipping in this unguarded moment, and I should have apologized and left, but instead I moved into the room and settled in the chair opposite him, offering silent companionship without demands or questions. And we sat in quiet for long minutes before he started talking, words loosened by alcohol and isolation, and perhaps the strange intimacy of 2 a.m. honesty. He described finding Catherine's accident scene in detail that made my chest ache, the way her car had wrapped around the concrete barrier, how he'd known immediately something was wrong because Catherine was a careful driver, how the investigation had confirmed brake line tampering, but never identified who'd ordered it or why, whether she'd been targeted specifically or was simply collateral damage in some rival's scheme against him. And the not knowing haunted him worse than confirmed enemies because he couldn't direct his rage or exact appropriate vengeance or protect against faceless threats. And every night he replayed those hours wondering what he'd missed, what threat he'd failed to neutralize, how he'd failed the mother of his child and left Thomas motherless through his own inadequacy. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the need to speak these things aloud. And when his words finally trailed into silence, I found myself sharing my own losses, describing my mother's death from cancer when I was 19, how my father had spiraled afterward into gambling and criminal associations, borrowing from dangerous people to chase the high that made grief temporarily bearable, how I'd tried to save him and failed, how when he finally died, I'd felt relief mixed with the grief, and that relief had filled me with guilt that still surfaced in quiet moments. And I admitted that sometimes I wondered if I'd fought hard enough, or if some part of me had wanted him gone so I could stop being responsible for someone determined to destroy himself. Understanding passed between us in the heavy silence, two people carved into shapes by grief and responsibility, and the weight of protecting others. And when Alexander reached across the small space between chairs to cover my hand with his own, the touch was warm and solid and achingly gentle. And neither of us pulled away, sitting connected in the lamplight while the rest of the house slept, and our careful defenses lay temporarily abandoned in the honest darkness. James found me in the West Wing sitting room on the 17th day, his expression professionally neutral, but carrying an undertone that made my stomach tighten. And he informed me with careful formality that Marcus Pembroke had requested a meeting with Alexander to negotiate disputed territory boundaries, a reasonable enough request on the surface, except that intelligence suggested Pembroke's organization had been weakened significantly by recent enforcement actions and legal troubles, making the timing suspicious. And James wanted me aware that Alexander had agreed to host the meeting here at the estate tomorrow evening, a decision that filled the household with crackling tension I could feel vibrating through every corridor and carefully positioned guard. Alexander summoned me to his study an hour later, his face carved from stone, and instructed me with clipped precision to remain in my wing with Thomas during the meeting, to keep the boy occupied and calm, to trust that security measures were extensive and I would be protected. And I agreed because the fear in his eyes beneath the command made arguing seem cruel, though unease coiled in my belly like something living and restless. The next evening arrived heavy with anticipation, guards positioned at intervals I'd never seen before, men in dark suits with earpieces speaking in codes I didn't understand. And I took Thomas to my sitting room with games and books, determined to keep him distracted while danger conducted its business elsewhere in his home. We built block towers and read stories about dragons, but I couldn't focus, my ears straining for sounds beyond our door, my skin prickling with awareness that something terrible waited just rooms away, and Thomas sensed my distraction, asking twice if Daddy was okay, if the bad men were coming back, and I reassured him with lies that tasted bitter because I didn't know if Alexander was okay, didn't know what was happening in that office where men who solved problems with violence were negotiating over territory and power. The sounds reached me near 8 o'clock, raised voices penetrating through the estate's thick walls, then a crash that made my heart stop. An instinct overrode every promise I'd made, because that crash meant violence had started and Alexander was in the center of it. I called for Marie, the head housekeeper who'd been stationed nearby, asking her to stay with Thomas, and the older woman's eyes widened, but she nodded, understanding something in my face that transcended normal protocols, and I moved through corridors toward Alexander's office, with my pulse thundering in my ears. Some primal part of me unable to stay safe while he faced danger alone. I reached the office as the door stood partially open, voices clear now. Pembroke's mocking tone demanding concessions, while Alexander's responses came too controlled, and I stepped into the doorway just as Pembroke's men drew weapons in synchronized motion, the negotiation revealed as the trap James had predicted, and Alexander's security responded instantly, but Pembroke moved faster, crossing the space to grab me before I could retreat, his arm an iron band across my chest and cold steel pressing against my throat, and the room froze into terrible stillness. Alexander's face transformed into something beyond human, every civilized mask stripped away, leaving pure lethal intent. And his voice when he spoke was arctic calm, offering Pembroke one single chance to release me unharmed. But Pembroke laughed, the sound edged with desperation and miscalculation, not understanding that I'd become something irreplaceable, that Alexander would burn the world before allowing me to be hurt. James and the guards had clear shots, weapons trained and steady, awaiting orders from their boss whose dark eyes found mine across the frozen tableau, and in that gaze I saw promise and demand, saw him asking me to trust him one more time, to believe he would keep me safe even with a knife at my throat and chaos one breath away from erupting. I forced every muscle still despite my heartbeat thundering so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it, the knife cold against my throat and Pembroke's breath hot against my ear. And Alexander's voice, when he began speaking again, was flat and emotionless, negotiating in tones that suggested complete capitulation, offering territory concessions and profit splits that made Pembroke's grip loosen slightly with premature triumph, and I kept my eyes locked on Alexander's dark gaze, seeing beneath the surrender performance to the predator, calculating angles and timing, waiting for the perfect moment when all variables aligned, and when his eyes flicked left in a movement so subtle I almost missed it, I understood the signal and let my weight drop suddenly, my knees buckling just as gunfire erupted in controlled precision, and I felt Pembroke's body jerk as James's shot took his shoulder, his grip releasing enough for me to twist away, and then Alexander was moving with speed that shouldn't be possible, crossing the space between us inhumanly fast, his hands disarming Pembroke and delivering brutal, efficient strikes that left the man crumpled and incapacitated within seconds. And then those same hands were on me, Alexander's fingers frantically checking my throat where the knife had pressed, tilting my face to examine for injury, his control completely shattered as he searched for blood or damage with shaking hands, and I kept insisting I was fine, unhurt, perfectly safe, but he didn't seem to hear, pulling me against his chest with crushing force, his heartbeat matching my own chaotic rhythm against my ear, and around us James and the security team efficiently removed Pembroke and his men, with the smooth coordination of people accustomed to cleaning up violence, weapons holstered and evidence managed with professional detachment that contrasted sharply with Alexander's fractured composure. He pulled me through a side door into a small private room, Some office or study I'd never seen before, and the moment the door closed, his hands gripped my shoulders, his eyes wild with rage and terror as he demanded to know why I'd disobeyed his instructions, why I'd left the safety of my wing, why I'd risked myself walking into danger when he'd specifically ordered me to stay protected, and the questions came rapid and overlapping, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't contain. And I answered simply that I'd heard the crash and known something was wrong, that despite every logical reason to stay hidden, I couldn't let him face threats alone, that some part of me needed to be there, even if I couldn't help, even if I made things more complicated, because the thought of him hurt while I cowered in safety was unbearable. My words seemed to break something in him, the last threads of his control snapping, and his mouth crashed against mine with desperate claiming force, kissing me like a man drowning who'd finally found air, his hands tangling in my hair and pulling me closer still. And I kissed him back with equal desperation, tasting fear and relief, and something deeper that had been building between us through all these careful weeks of denial and distance. And nothing about it was gentle or uncertain. Just raw need and the primal reassurance that we were both alive and safe and together in the aftermath of violence that could have ended so differently. Reality crashed back with the force of cold water. And Alexander released me abruptly, as if my skin had burned him, horror crossing his face in waves that transformed his features from desire to devastation, and he stepped back with hands raised between us like barriers, apologizing stiffly in clipped formal tones, blaming adrenaline and fear and the aftermath of violence for his loss of control, stating with finality that this cannot happen, that I deserve safety and normalcy instead of his blood-soaked world where knives press against throats and bodies crumple from gunfire. And something in his retreat ignited anger in my chest, burning away the lingering taste of his kiss, with fury at men who constantly decided my capability and choices without consulting the woman actually living inside my skin. I stepped forward as he retreated, my voice sharp when I told him I was tired of this pattern, tired of being treated like fragile glass that couldn't bear the weight of truth, that I hadn't stumbled blindly into his world through accident or coercion, but had walked in with open eyes and stayed through weeks of understanding exactly who he was and what he did. And the kiss wasn't some violation I needed protecting from, but something I'd wanted with equal desperation. Something that felt inevitable and right, despite every logical reason it should feel wrong. And my honesty seemed to unmoor him completely. His careful control fracturing as he argued weakly that I was Thomas's nanny, under his protection, that the power imbalance made anything between us impossible and wrong, that he couldn't take advantage of someone dependent on him for safety and livelihood. But his words rang hollow even to his own ears. I stepped closer still, bold in ways I'd never been before, asking him directly what he wanted, not what was proper or right or safe, but what his heart demanded when all the careful reasoning fell away, and his control became gossamer thin, stretched to breaking, and the answer when it came was rough and raw, admitting he wanted everything, wanted my safety and my smiles, and my presence permanently woven into his life, wanted to wake beside me each morning with the certainty that I was choosing to stay rather than trapped by debt or obligation, wanted to watch me with Thomas and know we were building something real and lasting instead of a temporary arrangement with expiration dates. But he insisted that wanting and taking were different things, that he'd taken enough in his life through force and manipulation and violence, and this, whatever this was between us, had to be my decision made with full information and complete freedom. Had to be something I walked into without coercion or pressure, because if I stayed, I needed to understand the reality of his world, the danger that would always circle at the edges of our lives, the violence he was capable of and had committed, the enemies who would see me as leverage and target against him, and he needed me to choose that future with clear eyes, or choose to walk away with my debts forgiven and my safety guaranteed, because he couldn't bear having me close while wondering if fear or obligation kept me there instead of genuine feeling. I took 2 days processing everything that had passed between us, the kiss still burning on my lips like a brand I couldn't wash away, the weight of his confession about wanting everything settling in my chest with equal parts terror and exhilaration, and I moved through the estate in a fog of indecision, caring for Thomas with automatic gentleness, while my mind spun through impossible calculations of risk and reward, safety and desire, logic and feeling that refused to align into clear answers. Thomas sensed the tension immediately, with that uncanny intuition children possess, his small face creasing with worry as he asked repeatedly if he'd caused problems, if I was leaving because of something he'd done wrong, and each anxious question broke my heart a little more as I reassured him with fierce hugs that nothing was his fault, that some things were complicated in ways that had nothing to do with him. And through comforting him, I realized with crystalline clarity just how deeply I'd bonded with this child, how his happiness had become as essential to me as breathing, how the thought of walking away from his life felt like amputation. Staff whispers followed me through corridors, conversations dying when I approached, meaningful glances exchanged between household members who were clearly aware something fundamental had shifted in the carefully maintained distance between their employer and the nanny, and I felt exposed under their speculation, uncertain of my own heart, much less ready to have it examined by dozens of observant strangers. James approached me on the second afternoon, as I sat in the library pretending to read while actually staring unseeing at the same page for 20 minutes, his usual efficiency softened by something almost gentle as he asked permission to speak candidly. And when I nodded, he settled into the chair across from me and began revealing history I hadn't known, explaining that Alexander had refused all relationships since Catherine's death, had turned away women from his world and outside it with equal firmness, had focused solely on Thomas's well-being and business expansion with single-minded intensity that worried everyone who cared about him, and whatever was happening now with me terrified Alexander precisely because it mattered, because for the first time in years he was allowing himself to want something beyond mere survival and duty. I examined my heart with the brutal honesty the situation demanded, acknowledging that I'd fallen completely for both father and son, for this broken family that somehow fit the broken pieces of myself. And Alexander's darkness didn't frighten me the way it probably should, because I'd seen how carefully he controlled it, how the violence he was capable of was always leashed by strict codes about who deserved his protection versus his wrath. And I'd witnessed his goodness in how he loved Thomas with awkward, fierce devotion, how he employed people other organizations would discard, how he maintained loyalty even when expedience might suggest betrayal. I found Alexander in the garden at dusk, the golden light painting him in shades of amber and shadow as he stood watching Thomas build elaborate structures with sticks and stones, his expression unguarded in a way it never was when he knew he was observed. And I approached slowly, my decision made, but my heart still racing with the enormity of what I was choosing, and when he turned, sensing my presence, his whole body tensed with anticipation and dread. I told him my decision simply without preamble or explanation, the words direct and clear, that I was staying not as just the nanny anymore, that I wanted to try building something real between us, if he was brave enough to let me in completely, to stop protecting me from choices I was fully capable of making for myself, and his expression cracked open with hope and fear, warring across features that were devastating in their vulnerability, his mouth opening to respond, just as Thomas noticed us both standing there, and came running over with dirt-smudged cheeks and shining eyes, grabbing both our hands and begging us to come see the fort he'd constructed, pulling us together with the innocent force of a child who knew nothing of the complicated adult emotions swirling around him, and the moment was perfect and terrifying, the three of us standing connected in fading sunlight while my future balanced on the edge of transformation. They began carefully in the days following my decision, Alexander courting me properly despite the unusual circumstances that had brought us together, and our new arrangement manifested in dinners after Thomas slept, where candlelight softened the hard edges of the dining room and conversations stretched long into night, revealing dreams that extended beyond mere survival. Hopes neither of us had articulated in years, because hoping felt too dangerous when life kept delivering loss instead of joy. Eleanor met his legitimate business associates at carefully orchestrated events. Men in expensive suits who ran shipping companies and real estate developments, the legal face of Alexander's empire, and she was slowly integrated into his public life with a careful precision that spoke of his commitment. Introduced as someone important, though the exact nature of that importance remained diplomatically vague to outsiders who knew better than to ask intrusive questions. The criminal elements stayed separate and invisible, but she was not naive enough to believe they had disappeared, understanding that Alexander's world operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and he was shielding her from the darkest parts, not through deception, but through the same protective instinct that made him station guards at every entrance and exit. James became an unexpected ally, his initial wariness transforming into something resembling friendship as he witnessed how Eleanor's presence affected his employer, how Alexander smiled more easily and carried less tension in his shoulders, and James appointed himself protector of both her well-being and Alexander's newfound lightness, running interference with business matters that might intrude on their fragile beginning. Thomas bloomed with two parental figures orbiting his world, his nightmares decreasing in frequency and intensity, his laughter becoming common instead of rare, and watching him flourish felt like the greatest achievement of Eleanor's life, better than any career success could have been. But threats did not disappear simply because happiness emerged, and Pembroke, humiliated and injured from his failed power play, plotted revenge from his diminished position with the focused rage of a man who had lost face and territory simultaneously. And intelligence reached James through carefully maintained information networks that an attack was being planned, something targeting what Alexander valued most in calculated cruelty designed to wound deeper than business losses ever could. Security intensified again with additional personnel and surveillance, the estate becoming fortress once more, and Alexander struggled visibly between his instinct to protect Eleanor through total control and his newer understanding that she needed respect for her autonomy, that treating her like fragile property would destroy what they were building as surely as any external threat. She insisted on awareness instead of sheltering, demanding to know the risks she faced rather than being kept ignorant for false comfort. And they argued with passionate intensity about acceptable precautions versus suffocating control, their relationship strengthening through conflict and compromise rather than weakening, learning each other's boundaries and limits through friction that sparked heat. One night, after a particularly heated disagreement about whether she could continue taking Thomas to his music lessons, had escalated into broader arguments about trust and partnership. Their reconciliation was passionate and desperate, bodies saying what words could not adequately express. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of sex and possibility, Alexander admitted he loved her, the words raw and unpracticed, emerging like confession torn from somewhere deep inside where he had locked away such vulnerability years ago. Eleanor answered in kind without hesitation, sealing the declaration with touch and promise, her hands mapping the scars on his skin, while her heart mapped the scars on his soul, both of them damaged and healing simultaneously, building something new from the wreckage of their separate pasts. Pembroke's final play came during Thomas's spring concert at Westbrook Elementary, the same school where everything had begun months earlier, and Eleanor accompanied him that bright afternoon with guards positioned discreetly throughout the auditorium and parking lot, their presence professional enough to avoid alarming other parents, but visible enough that she felt the weight of Alexander's protection surrounding her, like invisible armor. Alexander was delayed by business meetings he couldn't postpone, legitimate negotiations with shipping contractors that represented the careful transition he'd been orchestrating for months. But he'd promised to arrive before Thomas's solo performance, his absence creating a hollow anxiety in Eleanor's chest, even as she smiled and chatted with other parents who had no idea the dangerous currents flowing beneath this ordinary school event. Pembroke's remaining crew made their move in the parking lot as families filtered out after the concert concluded. Thomas's small hand warm in Eleanor's as they walked toward the car. And suddenly, men were emerging from a van with mechanical precision, their intent clear in how they moved to surround and separate her and Thomas from the guards. But Alexander had anticipated this exact scenario, his counter-strategy already in motion with additional security concealed among the crowd. And the moment Pembroke's men revealed themselves, Alexander's people swarmed from concealment with overwhelming force, intercepting the attack before hands could touch either Eleanor or Thomas. James arrived simultaneously with police vehicles, legitimate arrests made possible by months of evidence Alexander had been meticulously gathering, documentation of trafficking and racketeering that made cooperation with federal authorities not betrayal of street codes, but calculated strategy. And Eleanor watched with stunned realization as Pembroke himself was taken into custody 6 blocks away in a coordinated federal sting, his entire organization dismantled in a single precisely timed operation. The threat ended not with the violence she'd braced for, but with chess moves played across months. Alexander using legal channels and strategic information to eliminate danger without adding blood to hands already stained, and she understood with crystalline clarity that he'd been transitioning operations toward legitimacy slowly and carefully for Thomas's future, for the possibility of building a life with her that didn't require constant vigilance against criminal rivals. Alexander arrived as cleanup finished, his car screeching into the lot with barely controlled panic, and he was out and moving before the engine died, his eyes wild until they found Eleanor and Thomas safe and whole surrounded by his people, and then he was crushing them both against him with shaking hands and ragged breathing, his control shattered by how close he'd come to losing everything that mattered. Thomas asked with innocent directness if the bad men were gone now, his voice muffled against Alexander's chest. And Alexander pulled back enough to look his son in the eyes and promise yes with absolute certainty, meaning it in ways he'd never been able to promise safety before, the threat truly neutralized rather than temporarily suppressed. That night after Thomas finally fell asleep, exhausted by excitement and residual fear, Alexander asked Eleanor formally to stay forever, not as employee or even girlfriend, but as partner, as wife if she would have him, as mother to Thomas in truth and whatever other children they might create together, his proposal raw and vulnerable. A man offering everything he was and everything he had without strategy or calculation, just desperate hope that she would choose him completely. Eleanor accepted with full heart, her yes emerging without hesitation or doubt, and Alexander's relief was visceral, the tension draining from shoulders that had carried impossible weight for too long, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world believed about Alexander Harcourt, feared boss of the Eastern Territory. The wedding was private 6 weeks later, just family and the trusted inner circle who had witnessed their unlikely journey from employer and employee to something infinitely more profound. And the estate's garden was transformed into an intimate ceremony space with white flowers and golden afternoon light that made everything feel touched by grace. Thomas served as ring-bearer, beaming with joy so pure it brought tears to multiple eyes as he carried the rings with solemn importance, his family becoming official in ways that satisfied something deep in his child's need for permanence and security. Eleanor wore simple, elegant white, a dress that cost more than her entire previous wardrobe, but felt right against her skin, and Alexander's eyes when he first saw her held everything. Words could never adequately express. Love and wonder and fierce possession and gratitude all layered together in a look that seared straight through her chest. James toasted to unlikely beginnings and fierce protectors, his usually stoic demeanor cracking to reveal genuine affection for both bride and groom. And even the hardened security personnel who ringed the garden perimeter wore slight smiles, infected by the happiness radiating from their employer who they'd only ever seen controlled and cold. The estate that had felt like a fortress during those first terrifying weeks now felt like home in truth. Rooms that had intimidated with their grandeur becoming familiar spaces filled with Thomas's laughter and Alexander's rare smiles, and Eleanor's growing confidence in her place within these walls. Alexander continued legitimizing his business empire with methodical precision, using power built through violence and fear to instead protect and provide through legal channels. His transition gradual enough to avoid destabilizing territories, but steady enough that Thomas would inherit businesses rather than criminal enterprises. Eleanor returned to school online, pursuing teaching credentials she'd abandoned years ago when her father's debts had required immediate income rather than future investment. And she was planning to eventually work with at-risk youth, children like Thomas, who'd witnessed too much, too young, like she herself had been before circumstances hardened her. Thomas thrived with stable, loving parents, his trauma healing through security and patience, and the knowledge that two adults would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. His nightmares becoming rare exceptions rather than nightly occurrences, his joy in simple things returning as childhood should be joyful. Months later, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant, the positive test both expected and miraculous, and Alexander's joy was uncontainable, tempered only by protective fear that something might go wrong, that happiness this complete couldn't be sustained. She grounded him with steady hands and steadier words, reminding him they were building something new together, that the past's scars remained but didn't define them, that fear couldn't be allowed to poison the beautiful thing they'd created from such unlikely beginnings. On a quiet evening in late spring, the family sat together in the garden, where Eleanor had once played blocks with a lonely boy and his guarded father, back when they'd been strangers navigating careful distance. Thomas chattered about his day at school, his best friend's upcoming birthday party, the science project he was excited to build, while Alexander's hand rested on Eleanor's growing belly, feeling their daughter move and kick with the vigor that made Eleanor breathless. She thought back to that terrifying moment in the supply closet at Westbrook Elementary, when protecting a crying child had seemed like simple human decency, instinct rather than choice, and how that single decision had led here, to love she never imagined possible, to becoming mother and wife to people who needed her as much as she needed them. Alexander met her eyes over Thomas's head, understanding passing wordlessly between them, as it so often did now. Two people who'd learned each other's languages of love and protection. They had built safety from danger, family from isolation, love from the most unlikely beginning imaginable. Thomas pulled them both into an enthusiastic hug, his arms barely spanning their combined bulk, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that every frightening step had been worth reaching this moment. This was home. This was family. This was the happy ending she would protect as fiercely as they protected her, with everything she had, for as long as she lived.